Hello and welcome to this evening's Live from Paris. I'm Belle Lupton. It's midnight here in the French capital. Let's get you up to date with our headlines. Campaigns ratchet up a notch in the UK a day ahead of the EU referendum. Opinion polls still showing both sides neck and neck. A U-turn from the French government, which now says a march against its controversial work reform bill can go ahead in Paris, despite security concerns. And the US joins its American neighbours to intervene in Venezuela's political crisis. But President Maduro says he's not about to call a referendum on his leadership. We begin in the UK, where in a matter of hours, the polls will be open in a referendum on Britain's EU membership. The last 24 hours of campaigning have been frenzied, with each side trying to entice last-minute swing voters to their camps, as opinion polls show both sides pretty much neck and neck. The final TV debate has finished, with guests including politicians like far-right leader Nigel Farage, but also TV chefs and reality TV stars. Well, earlier I spoke to our UK correspondent Bénédicte Pavillot. I asked her whether we'd seen a gear change in campaigning today.
Since the crack of dawn, both camps, the Leave camp and the Remain camp, have been crisscrossing the country, taking planes, helicopters, buses, minivans, you name it, they've been taking it. Quite extraordinary, making their last pitch to their voters to energise their supporters, but also to try and swing the undecideds, who we think are about sort of 11-12% of people. At times, we know through the 4-month campaign, officially 2-month campaign, it's been quite acrimonious, but today is very much trying to, as I said, energise it and get out their slogans. So David Cameron starting the day in London, but then going up north. And what is interesting and very emblematic of this campaign is the fact that, for example, David Cameron's been sharing a platform not just with a former Conservative Prime Minister, Sir John Major, but also, for example, with Labour's Harriet Harman, later on with Gordon Brown, the former Labour Prime Minister. So that's been true very much also of the Leave camp. So this has been quite extraordinary, the bedfellows, the alliances that have been created across parties for both the Leave and the Remain camp.
And in a campaign criticised for the coarsening of its rhetoric, one group has bucked the trend. Opération Croissant, as it's called, travelled from Paris to London earlier. Its mission to woo the Brits into staying in the EU. Volunteers handed out croissants and love letters handwritten by their neighbours across the Channel. The pastry and postcards didn't last long, though. The British police shut the operation down, saying it broke electoral laws. And it's not just the French worrying about tomorrow's referendum results. Over in the tiny British territory of Gibraltar, they know which way they want the vote to go, as Fernand Vantetz reports.
These cars and motorbikes carry thousands of workers and tourists to Gibraltar every day. Located off the southern tip of Spain, the tiny peninsula, also known as the Rock, is increasingly alarmed at the prospect of Britain leaving the European Union.
There might be a lot of debate. As we say in a family, you fight within the family, but you don't leave the family, because as Cameron said, if what you want to be, little England or little France, or we've got to be together.
Half the size of London's smallest borough, Gibraltar largely depends on tourism, financial services and online gaming. Low taxes and access to the EU single market make it attractive for investors. A vote for Brexit would change things dramatically.
How do you change your economic model to go from being able to sell to 520 million people to sell only to 32,000 people? These are challenges which are existential to the current economic model. We would have to completely reposition our economy, and it's something that is going to be very difficult.
Without the free movement of people, shops that sell alcohol and tobacco, far cheaper than on the mainland, would also be hard hit. Spain, which ceded the territory back in 1713, senses an opportunity. If Brexit happens, the Spanish foreign minister said his country would be happy to share British sovereignty over the rock, allowing it to keep its access to the EU.
And tomorrow's referendum will take place exactly a week after British MP Jo Cox was killed in a violent attack in her constituency in the north of England. A staunch Remain campaigner, today, Wednesday, would have been Cox's birthday. Her husband Brendan paid this tribute in London earlier.
Today would have been Jo's 42nd birthday. She would have spent it dashing around the streets of her hometown, trying to convince people that Britain is stronger in Europe. She feared the consequences of Europe dividing again, hated the idea of building walls between us, and worried about the dynamics that that could unleash. Jo's killing was political. It was an act of terror designed to advance an agenda of hatred towards others. What a beautiful irony it is that an act designed to advance hatred has instead generated such an outpouring of love.
The husband of murdered politician Jo Cox. Now, France's government has agreed to allow a march to go ahead tomorrow in Paris against its controversial labour reforms. The decision comes soon after a ban had been announced for security reasons. 2,000 police officers will be on call and 100 individuals have been forbidden from attending after last week demonstrations turned violent. Josh Vardy reports.
Banning a popular protest on the streets of Paris, a decision that dramatically backfired on the French government. Outcry followed the announcement that police chiefs had deemed the protest against labour reforms on Thursday enough of a security risk to forbid it from going ahead, suggesting a much smaller, static protest. A compromise was eventually reached with union chiefs on Wednesday morning.
The government took its desire to shut down the social movement to a new level by forbidding the Paris protest on the 23rd of June. After closed discussions with the Interior Minister, the unions have obtained the right to protest in Paris on the 23rd of June on a route proposed by the Interior Minister.
The labour reform protests come at a time while France is still under a state of emergency put in place following the terror attacks in November. Meanwhile, the country is also hosting the Euro football tournament, which has seen its own share of unrest. Authorities have voiced concerns that violence would break out as it had in previous marches, citing the 14th of June in particular.
Previous protests, specifically the one that took place on the 14th of June, saw an unacceptable level of violence. This protest led to buildings being damaged, as well as businesses, and 28 police were injured. A protest of the same nature cannot be allowed to happen.
A decision to forbid the protest outright would have been historical. The last time a union protest was banned in France was in 1962, at the end of the Algerian War.
To the US now, where thousands have been forced from their homes in Southern California, chased by wildfires that have been raging for up to a week in some areas. A change in the weather in California has brought some relief to firefighters battling the blaze, but the lull is expected to only be temporary. The weather in southwest Utah and eastern Arizona has been less kind to the authorities, who are also fighting wildfires there. The US is joining forces with its American neighbours to try and intervene in Venezuela's political and economic problems. A senior US diplomat has met with President Nicolas Maduro, who's under pressure from the opposition to hold a referendum on his leadership. The Organization of American States will convene later this week. Maduro's government insists, though, that it won't back down, despite food riots earlier this month in which several were killed. Our correspondent Gallagher Fenix sent this update from Washington.
The situation is growing worse by the day in Venezuela, where food is running low. This has caused for some looting in certain areas. Some hospitals are also reporting that medicine is scarce, and the inflation rate, 472%, according to the International Monetary Fund, is the worst in the world. This very serious situation will be at the heart of talks in Washington, D.C. at the Organization of the American States, with two very sharply divided camps. On the one hand, those who oppose the regime of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, who want to exclude him from the organization or impose financial sanctions on him and his regime. And on the other hand, those who support him, such as Bolivia, whose representative at the Organization of the American States we interviewed.
El secretario general Almagro claramente se ha identificado.
In this conflict, the Secretary General of the Organization of the American States, Luis Almagro, has clearly taken sides with the Venezuelan opposition. That opposition is seeking to topple a constitutionally legitimate government which was elected by the people. Instead, all of our countries should focus on respecting democracy and the rule of law throughout the continent.
The United States are taking part in this debate, and they have been holding talks with members of the opposition in Venezuela who are demanding that the current president, Nicolas Maduro, step down. U.S. officials have said that by holding these talks with a country that is considered to be hostile to the U.S., they want to avoid a humanitarian crisis and perhaps a bloodshed that could spill over into the region. The Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, has said that he is open to the idea of a rapprochement between his country, Venezuela, and the United States, although he continues to hold the Americans, or at least the American government, responsible for much of the ills that are currently plaguing his country.
Gallagher Fennick there, our correspondent in Washington. And that brings us to the end of the programme. That's it from me, but don't go anywhere because Mark Owen will be here in a minute with the debate, and I'll be back with an update at past. Do stay with us.